you must first understand your perspective, how you got to the view you have about a particular issue. And in understanding that, unless you have blinders on, it becomes obvious that different people may have taken different roads on that issue and therefore have different views of that issue. And that's how they have different opinions of that issue. And then it makes it difficult for you to sit there and say, I don't understand how you can think that. This seems obvious to me. And it's obvious that you're wrong. you know, if you understand the role of perspective, then it makes it easier for you to adopt different perspectives. And when you can adopt different perspectives temporarily.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
I've always believed that absolutism is the final destination of those who wish to be dictator. In order to truly be authoritarian, you have to have absolute truths that have no caveats, have no exceptions.
There's no debate on those truths.
There's no debate. Well, I don't know any of those truths. Every truth is true in a certain set of circumstances. And when those circumstances change, the truth changes. And if you aren't willing to accept change, if you aren't willing to provide appropriate analysis and discernment when you apply your truths, then you're taking the easy route and you run the risk of causing injustice for some in order to keep your life simple.
Isn't one of the more significant responsibilities of being a leader to help others to change?
Yes. Unfortunately, for those of us who are trying to be leaders, yes. That means stepping into uncomfortable situations. And it also means challenging even those who are historically aligned with your truths.
But even if they are historically aligned, or maybe even if they're 180 degrees, it's just the small changes, the steps forward, that is a responsibility of being a leader. It's those getting people to act and think just one molecule differently. But it's great leaders are great change agents, aren't they?
I'm not sure about that. I think you just introduced two, not diametrically opposed, but two concepts that are on different parts of the spectrum.
Okay.
Great leaders have to accept progress in small steps.
Right. Progress being change.
And that means that they have to focus many times on, as you so eloquently put it, minor elemental issues, right? I've developed a talk on perspective. In the large scheme of things, that talk seems like a waste of time to me sometimes. I'm sitting here trying to tell people how perspective creates different views, leads to different judgments. And at the same time, I'm thinking, to what end? I'm trying to inform people that in order to solve complicated problems, you must first understand your perspective, how you got to the view you have about a particular issue. And in understanding that, unless you have blinders on, it becomes obvious that different people may have taken different roads on that issue and therefore have different views of that issue. And that's how they have different opinions of that issue. And then it makes it difficult for you to sit there and say, I don't understand how you can think that. This seems obvious to me. And it's obvious that you're wrong. you know, if you understand the role of perspective, then it makes it easier for you to adopt different perspectives. And when you can adopt different perspectives temporarily, it makes it easier for you to clarify your view on an issue by using language that they might be able to understand better. But it also runs the risk of your developing a deeper understanding of the issue from a different perspective as well. And it may end up changing your view of that issue.
Perspective is what caused me to pick up the phone, because I had a perspective and I needed help understanding other people's perspectives.
Yes.
And that's where conversations come from, is seeking somebody else's perspective, whether we're looking at a medical case and trying to come up with a diagnosis and we seek input from a specialist, or whether we're looking at a political or governmental or other issue and we seek perspective of others. I think the discussion on perspective is huge in the global scheme of things. And I don't know whether you do that talk on perspective for the veterinary students, or whether you do it for other faculty, or whether you do it for the deans, or where you do that talk. But I think this concept of perspective is huge in trying to narrow and understand the chasm that currently exists within this country, because it's your perspective. It doesn't mean it's wrong or right. It's your perspective, and understanding others' perspective can help bring people together. And again, I think it's a great word to explain how we started this going back a while.
So far, I've given the talk to a corporate practice group and my senior students.
Okay.
They just got it. And the reaction was that evening, we had dinner with seniors. So it was just a casual dinner. And they playfully used the word perspective during the entire meal. Say things like, I have a different perspective on that. And you know, it made a mark. And I was proud. I was gratified that I was able to give them another tool.
Well, it's interesting, because the perspective as a veterinarian is one thing, and as a pet owner is another. And I don't know whether you covered that with the veterinary students, but the perspective of where does the pet fit in the household, the perspective on the cost of care and the spectrum of care, it's very difficult as a healthcare provider to not look at the perspective from the position of the patient. But in veterinary medicine, you have to look at it not only as the perspective of the patient, but also of the pet owner who ultimately makes that decision. So those of us who would like to offer the best option all the time, sometimes, most of the time, have to consider the perspective of the pet as well as the pet owner. So I think perspective is a great term.
When the students get to their senior year, up to that point, when they meet with the dean, I'm always interested in how the curriculum is going and what problems have they had, et cetera. By the time they get to the senior year, I realize that there's nothing I can do about it. They're on the way out, and I rely on the course, the vet issues course, to address many of the elements so that they don't get to forget life that's going on outside of their world, and to remind them that they're about to occupy a premier space in society, and that they need to be advocates for whatever their views are in terms of social justice, et cetera, how they can be effective leaders. And in this particular year, I decided to use the perspective talk. But it was also a way of challenging the group on social justice, because, as you know, we've talked about it in our podcast separately, but I linked 3 major interactions I had with law enforcement in my lifetime. I link them all together to explain my perspective of Black Lives Matter. And then I distinguished the Black Lives Matters idiom by saying, some people hear Black Lives Matter as only Black Lives Matter and get insulted. I kind of hate giving the perspective talk. It really bothers me to realize that I can use my life to exemplify how law enforcement affects a Black man, and then realize that I'm not uncommon.
Oh, you've been the rule, not the exception.
I've been the rule.
If you went through your 60 plus years without an experience, that would have been the exception.
Exactly. And I bring up in my discussion that if you aren't asking that question, then you're being blinded by your own perspective. Because when you do ask that question, the first answer you might have is, well, that makes sense. He's Black, so he's likely to be a criminal.
Don't we call those microaggressions?
Yes, we do. Or implicit biases.
Yeah, right.
Right? It's only an aggression if you voice it. If you're thinking it, then it's not even a microaggression. It's just a micro thought.
Right.
But still, but it's more of an implicit bias if that's the first thing you think when you ask that question. But at some point you have to say, so how did you become a dean? And I kind of know Phil, so Phil's not that kind of person. And then the incidents themselves are not in response to criminal behavior. So you suddenly realize, why did I even ask that question? And so that's the struggle you have when you come at it from another perspective. But I use those 3 incidents to create the understanding that my interpretation of Black Lives Matters is Black lives also matter. But we must say it because my experience suggests it doesn't, that they don't.
It's interesting. In your discussion, you used the term Black Lives Matter, and you used the term of Black Lives Matters. And that S can really make
a difference. Yes.
And so, because from what I gather, the group or the belief is Black Lives Matter ! But yes, it's the Black Lives Matters that are the focus. The matters that impact Black lives,
yes,
are the issues. So
the phrase is actually Black Lives Matter.
Right.
But Black Life Matters,
right,
is another phrase we could use, right?
Exactly.
That has a totally different meaning.
Absolutely. And the 3 experiences you had are Black Life Matters. That's
true. And the 3 experiences that I had question whether Black lives matter.
Exactly. Isn't it? But it's those small nuances in the way things are said, or letters that are added or left out, that are part of perspective as well.
Absolutely.
So as I was listening to you and you added the S there, I was trying to determine the group or the impact.
Yeah, right.
So it was just me listening as I do acutely and micromanaging conversations from that standpoint.
But well, I had a recent experience with my first year students. I'm facilitating a group right now. And when I normally teach receptor function in immunology, I love to use the scene from Star Wars. I described the scene from Star Wars where Han Solo comes out of hyperspace because he thinks he's at the destination of a planet, and the planet's gone. And he thinks he sees a moon where the planet should be. And when you see it, it's just a sphere of reflected light that's smooth. And Han Solo says, well, maybe we can land on the moon. I forget the teacher's name, but one of the other actors says, that's no moon, that's a ship. And as they get closer, that smooth sphere suddenly becomes a ship, and you can see docking bays and guns, and all of a sudden you realize it's a rough surface. And so I try to create this image of how a cell actually looks under a microscope, but it takes electron microscopy to pick up the subtleties of the membrane. The membrane of a lymphocyte has antibodies and antigens stuck to their membrane or expressed on their membrane that is the mirror image of a docking bay, if you will, on a dendritic cell or on an epithelial cell. But you have to get close enough to understand how rough the membrane actually looks, that there are hills and valleys and 3D architecture. I use that technique to answer a question one of the students raised. And in the chat, in the chat, one of the students said, "I've never seen Star Wars." Now, my immediate response was, "Of course you haven't. When Star Wars came out, she wasn't even born." And so I apologize for using a dated analogy. And then later on, I realized that's my perspective, that the reason she hadn't seen Star Wars is because she's too young, right? Well, no, she may not have seen Star Wars because she's not a Trekkie. She may not have seen any sci-fi movie because she doesn't like sci-fi. It may have been because of a temporal difference between the two of us. I went there and said, I apologize for using a dated analogy. I guess I just showed how old I am.
You had a generational bias.
I had a generational bias, exactly. And I suddenly understood that my implicit bias in that instance. And we tend to, people who don't think they have bias, they focus on the word bias when they should be focusing on the word implicit.
Right. It is interesting, the concept of perspective, because it really influences everything we think about. It's our perspective as you're driving and somebody's moving slow. The perspective may be that they're texting. As somebody is weaving in and out of lanes, the perspective is they must be in a rush. We don't know if they're driving slowly because their tire light came on and they're worried about having a flat tire. We don't know if they're weaving in and out of lanes because somebody sitting next to them is in labor and they've got to get them to the hospital. But our perspective as we watch it is whatever implicitly is in our brains and we're thinking about it. And we're probably also envisioning what the driver looks like with our own group of biases from that standpoint. So this discussion on on perspective is really huge, because your students are going to be moving from a somewhat passive student perspective to, as noted, a leadership teacher perspective. They are going from Luke Skywalker to Yoda. And that's a really difficult perspective initially to accept. I mean, they've been so in the recipient role for so many years, and now they are on the donator, giver, whatever role that would be. As a doctor, they're in a much different role. So this discussion of perspective is very vital going forward, and it's probably not an issue or a topic that you want to drop. It's one that you want to keep forefront.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I kudos on that one. I think we could do a whole talk on that from that standpoint, and just looking at things from different perspectives. Because as a Yankees fan, anybody who's a Red Sox fan, they have no perspective of what sports is about, you know. And I'm sure you're getting ready to go watch some SEC football or something.
I'm definitely going to watch some SEC football.
Yeah,
I'm going to watch whatever is on. Sometimes I'm forced to watch Big 12 football too.
Yeah. But it is an interesting perspective, and there's even a perspective regionally based, because as I talked to people on the East Coast yesterday, and they said, well, how's your gorgeous weather in California? Well, yesterday wasn't exactly a gorgeous day, but their perspective is California's early morning haze burning off to mid-afternoon sunshine, high in the 70s.
You have to come from a perspective of ill weather for a period of time to appreciate California weather. I miss the barometric depression that occurs when a storm is about to approach. I now realize that when I lived in Mississippi and Alabama, there were weekly reminders that nature was more important than anything I did. You know, it kind of it changed my perspective about how important I was.
Well, you got a strange perspective. What can I say? But
And so, but out here, it's easy to fall into a slumber that says I control everything.
yeah, well, you moved out here 15, 18 years ago.
Yeah,
I moved out here 35 years ago, and so I moved from Illinois. And I would say every day, every weekend that it wasn't raining, snowing, or cold, we had to go outside and do something. You always
right.
have to be outside to do something. And then after about maybe 3, 4, 5 months, when you realize that every day is nice and you don't have to worry about finding a nice day, your perspective changes to one
Exactly.
of, you know what, we can go to the movies today and we're not going to miss anything outside because it'll be just as nice next weekend.
Well, and not only that, we plan events outside and then get surprised when it's a little too cold.
Yes, you mean 60 degrees?
Yeah, or it's windy,
Yeah,
and we hadn't thought about that, or it actually rains,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
you got and I've got 300 people that are supposed to be sitting outside, not even under a tent because we weren't. It was going to be in the evening, but nobody thought to even look. First of all, we probably planned the event 3 months in advance. But sometimes in our planning, we don't even think of the possibility that it might rain.
I was in Illinois 2, 3 weeks ago for class reunion and educational conference, and the reunion dinner was supposed to be outside in a tent in October
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Illinois.
in Illinois.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So, and I have to believe that they had a plan A and a plan B, which they
Yeah.
must have, because they, for lack of a better term, pivoted very quickly because it was raining, um, for the tents. Because I can't imagine having been outside with wet grounds and mud and everything else for 300 some odd people, but they were able to pivot the event to the inside. So it's also a perspective of having backup plans, knowing that you have issues, weather being one, that can impact your plans.
Yeah,
So
but I just think the difference is that and I think that even in California we recognize the possibility, but the probability is 9%. You got a 9% chance of putting a tent up and being okay in
yeah,
California, and a tent is all we need in California, even if it rains.
well, you need space heaters too, because the minute it gets below 68 degrees, everybody's cold.
In a COVID environment, you may not want it to be too warm.
Yeah. Just to bring things full circle, the perspective you and I have together and the perspective that you and I have as individuals is one conversation that we've been having. But there's another conversation that's being had by people individually and group who have different perspectives.
Well, for instance, the first guest we had,
Yes.
she had a very unique perspective, and that perspective was largely influenced by her job.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's wrong.
No,
And see, that's part of the discussion, is that by having a different perspective doesn't mean somebody is wrong. And I think we've got to get over that, the fact that just because we agree to disagree, it doesn't mean somebody's wrong. It just means that's their perspective.
well, I think you make a very important point here. The conversation's goal is not to win.
Right.
The conversation's goal is to explore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I could never win.
I'm glad you know that. No,
Yes, Yoda.
no. Sometimes I think you don't believe me. I have learned as much from these conversations as you have. And perspective is what I've learned. I have learned why you believe what you believe. I also have learned why you don't know what you don't know. And in learning that, I realize how hapless I have been in trying to inform people of the challenges that have been placed in front. But one of the things I learned from our guest is that she seemed to think that many people use the court system because they had an insult, a simple insult. And that's an abuse of the court system. And I agree, it is. What I found interesting was she was more concerned about the abuse of the system than the defense of rights. And it is the danger to the rights that forces us to put up with the insults, with the abuse because of insults. Because from time to time, you can't tell the difference.
Ooh, I got to think that one through. But you're correct. You're correct. There are people who abuse the system, but there are people who have been abused that need the system.
Yes. And there are people who have been simply insulted that you would not think would have to use the system, but that insult was a derivative of a denial of a right or a derivative of an attack on a right, because the denial of that right had become part of the infrastructure, to the point that nobody had to go so far as to deny the right. They could only, they only had to infer or suggest or insult so that you did not take advantage of your right. And for most people, that's all they needed.
So isn't the legal system a debate between two perspectives?
Yes.
That of the prosecutor and that of the defense?
No, that of the plaintiff and that of the defendant.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, the word verbiage was incorrect. But yes, so it's a debate on perspective that a group of 12 will ultimately judge who did the better debate.
Or the judge.
Yes, depending on where you are in the legal system.
Right.
Virtually everything. There are perspectives, and again, they're not right or wrong.
No, they aren't, but there is a sense of right or wrong.
Right.
There is a sense that the judgment, and that's why we're disappointed with the judgment in Minnesota.
Right.
I'm sorry, Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, right. Kenosha.
Right. Kenosha, right? Because because there's the inference that the jury has made the right judgment. And now we have groups on both sides of the coin using that judgment for their own agendas, right? Instead of saying, this is the American system, and the prosecution failed to prove their case. This is one case. Now, we can argue about how this case was biased. We can argue about the influences of social parameters during the riots and during the trial. But one of the things we can't argue about too much is the system. This is the system that we have accepted. Now, some people want to destroy the system. Some people want to improve the system. But we're going to have to accept that the system is imperfect because the people who run the system are imperfect. There was an imperfect judge in this particular trial. There clearly were imperfect lawyers in this trial. And in the Minnesota case, there's one lawyer who doesn't want any Black preachers to come into the room.
How did you know that's where I was heading? That's exact. I was gonna. That's my. I was trying to look up Aubrey's first name. I'm pretty sure it was Aubrey. Is the Black gentleman? But what is your perspective when you hear that Black pastors influence the decision making of the jury just by sitting there?
Well,
I mean, how did you respond to that?
Oh, clearly I was outraged.
Yeah.
I don't think but at the same time, it was a muted outrage. You know, I'm not. I my surprise is that he said it,
Yeah,
not that he thought it.
right,
It
right.
that and he continued to say it. By the way,
Yes, yes.
it's there's a theory that he's trying to promote unrest
Yes, that's
outside
what
the
I heard.
courtroom
I heard that.
because he wants a mistrial.
Yes,
All right,
which means he
but
can't win.
exactly. But the fact that he wants a mistrial based on the race of a preacher, right? So he's also raising the presence of every other black person there. Because think about it, he's only talking about the black preachers who happen to be sitting beside the family.
Right.
Okay. Now there could be black preachers throughout the audience. So now everybody's looking around wondering, are you a black preacher? Because you're black. Are you a black preacher? Because you're black. Now it's not about being a preacher, it's about being black.
Right.
He's trying to raise the temperature. And once again, we're being asked not to carry a gun in a riot. Once again, we're being asked to be civil.
See, I guess what he couldn't say is, I don't want any blacks in the room. So he had to say, I don't want any black preachers in the room.
Yeah, but he's also proving the prosecution's case. Think about this.
Yeah.
His implicit bias is clearly against blacks, which explains why they shot the guy.
Right. Without any defense.
Without it, yes. And that's all the prosecution is saying anyway. The only reason they surrounded him in those pickup trucks, and then these are ex-cops deciding to arrest a black guy, and they have they're using the same argument that Rittenhour used. Yep. And that is, I took a gun to a knife fight and they had my gun, so I had to fire them. I had to shoot them.
Well, from my perspective, it's opening up huge opportunities for vigilante.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, whether you want to just pull somebody over for passing you at a faster pace, or, you know, whatever else you want to do with it, it's just going to change how people want to deal with issues, feeling that they may have no repercussions by doing so.
My other problem with all of these recent cases is the use of self-defense.
Yes, as a defense.
As a defense.
That's got a bias in it unto itself.
There's never a discussion about Arbery's self-defense.
Right.
When he grabbed the gun in self-defense.
Right.
In just about every case, you know, the case where the police break into an apartment and they shoot back in self-defense because they claim the boyfriend shot first. Well, why didn't he shoot in self-defense? Where was the discussion about his self-defense? Rittenhour was acquitted because he was being attacked. He was being attacked because he was threatening. He was a threatening figure. The public had not endowed an 18-year-old to carry an
AK-47, 15, whatever it was.
AR-15, I think. Right. I forgot. A military gun in a hopeful, peaceful protest. And so his presence was a threat. And I don't care if two of the people who approached him, who tried to disarm him, happened to have a gun. He created the threat. And it's probably a more reasonable assumption that I'm only going to approach you if I have a gun myself. The one person who didn't have a gun is the person who was maimed.
Yeah, of course.
And yet he had the courage to try to disarm this young man.
I just don't understand how there can't be some crime that was committed that day.
I agree. I totally agree.
Some crime. I mean, it may not be murder one. It may be manslaughter, but in some fashion, there had to be something that was done in violation of somebody's constitutional rights. And I just don't get it.
Well, you also now know that there was information that was denied the jury.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not. I don't know enough to question the jury's verdict.
Right.
Right. And I have no idea what the instructions were to the jury. And I don't know if the prosecution could appeal or even would appeal. I do know that he's not out of this. He now has to defend himself against civil suits. And they have no money, by the way.
Right. Rittenhouse or the people who's
Rittenhouse.
Yeah. Again, I look at it as a pacifist in many ways, and I just have a hard time. And I don't think we've even talked about guns at all, but I just look at it as a pacifist and try to figure out why go from Illinois to Wisconsin with a gun unless you had a reason to use it.
Yeah, well, I try not to get into motive, although I think some people, and I think Rittenhouse is one of them, based on what the limited times I've seen him, believe in intimidation, not necessarily intent to murder. He definitely proved that he'll defend himself. But he was having fun that night.
You know, the other interesting thing is if you look at the law, and I don't remember which show I was watching last night, but he's not even allowed to own that gun. But it's okay
if somebody gives it to him. No, he's not allowed to buy the gun.
He's not allowed to buy the gun, but he's allowed to transport it over state lines.
Yes. And apparently somebody bought it for him and gave it to him as a gift. That's the narrative they created.
Right.
I'm sure he gave that person the money to buy the gun for him. He couldn't buy the gun himself.
Nope. He also gave him about $8 for a 6-pack and outside of the 7-Eleven, which should be a crime unto itself, isn't it? You go and buy alcohol for a minor.
It is.
Yeah. It just, I guess, going back to the beginning of the conversation, it's just so hard to fathom where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I just have a hard time fathoming where we are right now.
And I understand that, but I think you may be in denial.
I probably am. I'm under 60 some odd years of denial that I didn't do more in the last 60 some odd years to get us. But
I think you do know where we are. I just think you don't want to recognize where we are, because you have to admit that your perspective of where you thought we were was wrong.
Absolutely. And again, goes back to Obama. I thought we were over the hump.
Right. It's hard enough to say we weren't over the hump, but it's even harder to say how far away from the hump we really are.
Oh, so true. So true.
And yet, here's a black man telling you we're closer to the hump than we've ever been.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've been re-listening to some of the podcasts done by the people who, copied us, Obama and Bruce Springsteen.
And Bruce Springsteen?
Yeah. And just Obama's perspective and Bruce's perspective. I'm much closer to their perspective to hear others who, black guy, white guy, New Jersey, Chicago, whatever. Somehow they got a lot more airtime than we did. I don't know what it is. Probably because you sing better than Bruce. I don't know, and I
no.
But it's interesting. I don't know if you've listened to it. Maybe I'll get that. Have you?
Yes.
Yeah, but Obama's storytelling is almost as good as yours.
Wow.
I mean, and even Bruce's storytelling is nowhere near as good as mine. But their life experiences and listening to them, it's really cool because I see in their conversations a lot of our conversations.
Yes. Yeah, that is gratifying. We don't have to wish them well at all. They're doing well, but I don't think we can have enough of those conversations.
Right.
Or enough of the perspectives on those conversations either.
So I want to leave a message for our listeners, which is continue to listen to us, but go and listen to Renegades, Springsteen and Obama's conversation as well, and share that as well as ours with other people who have different perspectives, and then get together with them and share perspectives, understanding that this isn't a question of right and wrong. It's just really a question of learning, making yourself better, and also helping the other person that you're having a conversation with become better as well.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.